about you, but I grew up with Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol as like a staple every year of the Christmas season. We read it as a story. We used to watch the movie version with George C. Scott playing Ebenezer Scrooge. I've since seen the Disney Christmas Carol with Mickey Mouse as Bob Cratchit and Duck for Scrooge. We've seen the Muppet ones, and there's all sorts of other variations of the same story, Christmas Carol, right? And if you see that story, if you know that story that imagines a character named Ebenezer Scrooge, this miserly person who doesn't care for his fellow human beings but only is concerned about hoarding his wealth, who's visited on Christmas Eve by the ghost of his former business partner, and then the spirits of Christmas past and Christmas present and Christmas yet to come, you know pretty quickly what kind of a story you're watching, right? Now, over enough years in my own life, seeing that story over and over and over again, it almost becomes like comfort food. It's just one of those traditions we're used to hearing or seeing. But the point of the story is actually pretty powerful. It's actually pretty provocative. And Charles Dickens, when he wrote this story, certainly wanted to suggest something of the meaning of Christmas, but had something to say about the meaning of life itself in that story. Anybody who knows A Christmas Carol, who knows the story of Ebenezer Scrooge and Tiny Tim and God Bless Us Everyone and the ominous ghost of Christmas yet to come, anybody knows the point of that story is to say something about real people living real life and what matters, about how we treat our fellow human beings and not how we hoard our stuff or our wealth, or how that wealth and that stuff becomes this unspoken invisible barrier that I don't see the needs of my neighbor. So if you were to watch or read A Christmas Carol, and at the end of that story, as Ebenezer Scrooge gets to turn over a new leaf and keeps Christmas in his heart every day of the year, if you watched that or read that story and thought to yourself, this was a story about how ghosts make chains because the ghost of Jacob Marley carries a chain, you would say, no, that's missing the point. The point of the story isn't really about whether ghosts do or do not have to wear chains or whether get the medal for making the chains. You say that's not really the point. Charles Dickens isn't really making a claim about whether people become ghosts when they die, or about whether there are or are not actual ghosts of Christmas present, Christmas past, and Christmas future. Those are inventions. Those are fictional things that are meant to be a part of a story that he tells. And even some of the images he uses, like the ghost of Christmas yet to come being this sort of grim reaper-like figure with the big ominous black robe and not speaking, he's just borrowing some of the standard images people had for the figure of death, for the grim reaper, right, that's been floating around in pop culture for centuries. So if you read A Christmas Carol, hopefully it becomes clear this isn't really a story where the author is claiming that there are or are not ghosts. It's a story that uses tropes like ghosts and spirits and Christmastide and all that to talk about what really matters, and about what happens when our hearts get so shriveled we are unable to see beyond the walls created by our wealth and our affluence to see the needs of our neighbors. If you can get that, then maybe that will help us be in the right frame of mind to understand a story that Jesus tells that is just as serious as the grave, and also that we sometimes make the dangerous mistake of misunderstanding or mishearing because it comes from Jesus, and we're not sure how we can allow Jesus to be creative as a storyteller like Charles Dickens. But in a way, the story we're going to be looking at this Sunday, sometimes called the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, is a story that works a lot like The Christmas Carol. So the story goes like this. In Luke 16, Jesus says, "There was a rich man who dressed in purple and fine linen, who feasted sumptuously every day. At his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, 'Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames.' But Abraham said, 'Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. besides all that, between you and us a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us. He said, Then, Father, I beg you, send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment. Abraham replied, They have Moses and the prophets, they should listen to them. He said, No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. He said to him, If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. And now that's a story, right? But here's the thing. Over enough centuries of hearing and rehearing, telling and retelling, and sometimes getting ourselves confused about what Jesus seems really to be talking about, Christians for a lot of history have tried to make that story to be actually about what Jesus thinks happens when you die, or a geography of the afterlife and how you map out where the realm of the dead is, Hades, and where Abraham and heaven are, and where you go to what stage, and where there's a big chasm, and why there are flames. We've spent an awful lot of time thinking this was a story that was meant to tell us what the afterlife is like, when that's not really Jesus' point, right? Jesus is borrowing the standard images of storytelling in his day, right? The way they talked about what happens when you die if you were a good, faithful child of Israel in the first centuries. You're gathered to your ancestors, right? That's how the book of Genesis talks. Abraham dies and he's gathered to his ancestors. Isaac and Jacob die. They're gathered to their ancestors. So, of course, it makes sense. They're gathered there into the bosom of Father Abraham. So this story doesn't really seem to be about Jesus saying, now I want you all to know, here's exactly what happens when you die. There's this fiery place, and then there's Abraham, and then if you do these things, you go to this place, and if you do these things, you go to this place. It's the same reason that A Christmas Carol isn't really about whether ghosts carry chains or not. It's a story that's meant to shake us up, to wake us up out of our complacency or our indifference and apathy toward the needs of our neighbor, and to take their concerns as seriously as the grave. And to ask the question, how is it that we can become so focused on our stuff and the comfort that that brings us that we can no longer see the neighbor around us, whether it's Lazarus in Jesus' story or Bob Cratchit and Tiny Tim in Charles Dickens' story. We make the mistake when we hear this story of letting this just be a bunch of speculation about the afterlife, when Jesus is a lot more interested in shaking us up in how we live now, just like the law and the prophets were. That's part of the end of that story, right? The man in the story, the rich man who had clearly not heeded the commandments or listened to the warnings of the prophets, who said that what matters in this life is how do we love one another, not how much money we have or how much status we rack up. Jesus seems to think the point of his story is how we use this life, how we use our resources, and to understand that God's commitment always has been to care for and to provide for the people that we treat as faceless, right? That's part of the grand reversal of this story, that there's this rich man who surely everybody knows his name in town. He has the nicest clothes. He has a gate around his house. He's got plenty of abundance and feasts sumptuously. He's the one everybody knows in town, but when he dies, he's just buried. But Lazarus, who everybody else treats like a nobody, his name is remembered. He's important enough that even the angels come and carry him up to heaven. This is sort of a storytelling way of saying the people that we treat as faceless, as unimportant, as forgettable, are never faceless to God. God is always concerned with the needs of those who are most vulnerable around us. And if we're going to be on the same wavelength as God, maybe we're called to re-examine how have we gotten so complacent about the needs of our neighbors, near and far, that we can just tune them out or forget about them. And what would it look like for us to rearrange our lives now, here and now, in light of what God has been saying all along matters? How do we love and care for those most vulnerable among us? That the real things that last are human beings who are beloved of God and not our stuff or our piles of money. So in the end, this story isn't about whether there are or are not flames in the afterlife for anybody and who has to be worried about going there. This is a story that's about the urgency of taking seriously how do we see the needs of our neighbor? How do we see the faces and stories of people who otherwise might get forgotten and treated like nobodies, but are never forgotten or faceless to God? I was thinking this week, at the beginning of this week, the news has broken that there's a hurricane just dumping water and causing devastation in Puerto Rico. And as I was listening to this news report and in the car earlier this week. I was thinking to myself as I'm listening to this story, for a brief instant, there was this temptation. You know what? I don't like this story. I'd rather listen to music. I'll turn this off and listen to music instead. And it occurred to me, there it is in me too. It is so easy to tune out the stories of the needs of neighbors, near or far, and to feel like, you know what, I've got enough technology, I've got wealth, I've got a car radio, I can change the station, I can be distracted from those needs, those faces, the Lazaruses around me, because I don't want to have to deal with them, and instead to be surrounded by the affluence I have. We still live with that temptation day by day by day. Hearing Jesus' story again, and maybe hearing it like Charles Dickens tells his story, A Christmas Carol, is something that's meant to wake us up, not that's meant to be something sentimental for the holidays, but something that's called to shake us up. How will we see the faces of God's beloved in the people that we so easily pass by, the people we treat as faceless, or as just a generic them, instead of the ones who are beloved of God? And how might it rearrange our lives and our priorities right here and now on this side of the grave, care for people the way God loves them, and not to let anybody be treated as faceless or an anonymous them in the crowd. That's the conversation we're having this weekend in worship, and we invite you to be a part of it.